Housing was and is probably the most important topic of city planning. Where will people live, in what conditions, and what will be the availability of places to live in? The communist era was known for the huge projects of new housing, but that era is over. So the question is, how will things be going forward? How did housing policies change during the economic transition of the 1990s, since it directly led to the housing situation that we experience today? In this video, let's talk about that, while in the city, I will build a brand new residential district next to the older panel blocks. Let's go. I talked about the housing policies of the communist era in episode 81 in more details, so I won't waste time with it now. I cannot really recap it either, as the details are important, so I would just need to repeat that entire video. So I highly recommend you stop this one and go rewatch that one first. But it's important to repeat that there were practically 4 types of housing based on the ownership structure and availability. Housing cooperatives, city flats, company flats, and private homes. Each one saw massive changes and shifts towards that private ownership, but not necessarily ownership of the actual users. Countries wanted to complete a switch to a free market approach, where the market would decide housing availability, quality, types of ownerships, and practically everything else. This meant that basically overnight, housing subsidies and other state benefits and influences disappeared or were cut down, massively impacting new housing construction and city development. Housing cooperatives were back in the day also the so-called construction housing co-ops. They directly, massively built new housing, since housing for the majority of new members did not exist yet. That system totally collapsed. Co-ops suddenly did not have access to, for example, depending on the country, very favorable loans from the state, very favorable or even free land, as land was all owned by the state and the state just wanted new construction, so it just gave it away, and overall other bureaucratic simplifications. Housing co-ops stopped growing, just finished some ongoing projects and only maintained their current housing fund. In time, lots of housing co-ops were then privatized. This type of privatization was at first quite simple. Tenants were also members of the co-op, and when they entered it, they paid some entrance fee, let's say, and then regular payments as rent, basically. So now they would only need to pay the so-called remaining price, and then the flat would be completely privately theirs. This remaining price was calculated based on the price of the flat the co-op spent on it when it was built, minus the tenant's payments, all of them combined. And since the building price of the flat was already, certainly by today's crazy standards, laughably low, the remaining price was also really, really small. My grandparents, for example, bought their flat in the mid-90s, after living there for some 20 or so years, for just a couple of tens of thousands of crowns, so practically a few months of salaries, even back then. Many people bought their co-op's flats like that, and those new owners inside one building would then form basically a homeowners association, which is practically a necessary arrangement, as the building needs to present itself as one organization when it comes to paying utilities or doing maintenance to the facade, the roof, and so on. But not everyone accepted the offer to buy their flat where they already lived from the co-op. Some people did not see any reason to, or just did not have the money currently. While the remaining price was very low, the rent or co-op payments were ridiculously low. So some people just wanted to continue comfortably like before. They did not see any difference in some legal status of the flat. They lived there, so that's it, isn't it? But that would just not be the reality. If the co-op was scheduled for disbanding, basically, and the members did not buy out their flat, then someone else did. In some cases, the co-op became a normal company, real estate manager, basically. This depended on the specific legal status of the co-op, who created it, who managed it, how would be the remaining members compensated, and so on. But in any case, the remaining tenants who did not buy were now fully inside the free market environment, which meant astronomical skyrocketing of rents. Lots of people realized they should have bought when they had the chance way too late. There were even cases of people mentally collapsing or even attempting to commit the thing to themselves as a result. In Czechia, there at least was something called the regulated rent, where owners could not just pump up rent indefinitely sky high, but it was legally capped, which protected, for example, the pensioners at the time. A regulated rent, however, ended, 10, 15 years ago roughly. I have an interesting experience with that one. When I moved to my previous rented flat, the owner told me how in the building there lives this old lady who had an indefinite contract signed sometime in the 90s. So a regulated rent still applied to her. And the owner, for some reason, vented to me how it angers her so much that she cannot raise the old lady's rent and somewhat looks forward to the lady leaving, if you know what I mean. Crazy. And that was apparently the reason the owner now avoids indefinite contracts like the plague, which is kind of the norm in Prague, for example. In Czechia, again, simply because I know about it, but do write a comment down below if you have similar situation in your countries. There are places, mostly around the border, where the collapse of the old communist industry turned those places into not exactly rich regions, making a lot of families struggle with this new rent situation. Unfortunately, these places also exactly became speculation paradise, flats being bought very cheaply by rich speculators from big cities in the wild privatization periods. A situation then developed which actually nicely but kind of weirdly illustrates how the state became totally clueless about possible solutions. Cities simply decided, in good but very naive faith, to help these families with rent by paying part of it for them. The speculators, however, immediately noticed that, so pumped up rent way above market levels of that area, because the city would just cover it. So basically the state started paying the speculators for making people's lives worse in these unfortunate locations. Lovely. These people then got the fitting nickname of traders with poverty. Some housing cooperatives did survive in some cities, but it was overall seen as a remnant of communism, something that required the state to hold its hand, which is unacceptable in the new market world. It doesn't matter that it's a perfectly normal, massive housing arrangement in some Western cities, but that's sort of typical for the post-communist Europe of the wild 90s, to apply the market solves everything mindset even harder than in the West. In some areas, countries pulled a handbrake in that approach, but housing doesn't really seem to be one of them. Anyways, moving on. State or city flats. Back in the day, these were mostly old flats because practically all flats were nationalized, but also some new prefab blocks. Here the situation was a lot wilder, since the tenants were just tenants, not members of some co-op with at least some say in the decision-making. Cities owning massive flat fund was also seen as a bad remnant of communism, so it had to be changed. Massive privatization started, but since a lot of this housing was nationalized, stolen in the beginning, it went hand in hand with restitutions, meaning return to the previous owners. But after some 40 years, a lot of them were not alive anymore, so it went to their children or other relatives. Sometimes it was not possible to find them. Sometimes the city just decided to not restitute at all. People also moved, either forcefully or willingly, so in a lot of cases the original owners did not live in those buildings, which had completely different tenants. The tenants themselves were then in a classic situation of being suddenly out in the open market, so similar cases as with the co-ops. Lots of real estate companies popped up, many foreign ones came in and started buying these properties on the cheap from clueless new owners who had no idea about the value of it or did not really care much about owning and taking care of a big residential block in the city because they could not even have the experience, they just did not have the idea, and it just overwhelmed them. Especially in very lucrative city centers, but also pretty much everywhere else, the real estate speculation was kickstarted right from the early 90s. There can be found some television clips talking about the insane jump in prices of, for example, empty plots of land, still empty after the Second World War, and so on. Especially the situation in city centers changed rapidly. During the communist times, there of course also were more desirable locations to live in, but you could have been a factory worker living on a historical square in a city flat. But these flats, these locations were suddenly mega expensive, center points of speculation, causing a big change in population distribution, let's say. On top of that, as soon as the city politicians discovered the potential in real estate, massive corruption started with privatizations of the housing fund. Flats went to them directly, to friendly real estate companies, or to whoever paid a little extra on the side. Depending on the city, they would sell off almost all of their previous housing funds, only maintaining very few ones for VIPs, like politicians once again, or sometimes for essential workers. Company flats were tied to the fate of the companies that owned them or even built them back in the day. The potential outcome for those was all over the place, ranging from absolute horror stories to pretty fair treatment. Some factories, either before or after privatization, offered their tenants to buy out their flats for various prices, usually discounted compared to the market. The tenants did not even need to work in those companies anymore after all the years, all the decades. So those were quite smooth and I'd say fair transitions towards private ownership. But then there are the horror stories. OKD is a Czech coal mining company in the Ostrava region. It had massive housing fund for around 100,000 people, relatives and workers of the company that fired tens of thousands of people in the 90s due to coal mining closures. So the tenants were already not in an easy situation. The fund is still the largest single housing fund in Central Europe. The company was privatized together with this fund, and the new owner promised to eventually sell the flats to their tenants. In the meantime, tenants invested big money into their flats since they thought it's practically certain it would be theirs at some point. By the way, a lot of these flats are located in the monumentally looking Poruba district in Ostrava, so the flats were already close to 50 years old, really requiring some repairs. Surprise, the fund owners did not keep their word. Instead, the entire housing fund was sold at a market price to a foreign investment company, which obviously has zero ties to the region, so only uses the fund as a cash cow, further draining the region. Legal disputes are still going on today, and it is the largest financial dispute in the country. Well, this development sounds rather depressive, doesn't it? Looking at the housing situation in Prague, for example, apparently a European capital with the highest housing unavailability, it sure looks like it. City flats are all but gone, especially new co-ops are a really unfunny joke, which I would like to cover in some video because it's crazy how pointless they are. Employers do not have housing anymore, and speculators, domestic and foreign, rule the markets and are actively encouraged to rule the markets. Housing situation is not all dark though. The increases in private ownership also meant a lot more private money could go into making existing or new housing better. Especially the blocks of flats or apartment buildings that have a high percentage of owners living there are in great conditions, some in excellent conditions. People have direct motivations to take care of their property that is 100% certainly theirs. They can freely upgrade it, freely buy not the cheapest accessories, without feeling like they are wasting cash improving someone else's property. They don't need to fear anymore they will lose a company or city flat if they say wrong things at work or to some party official. And overall, in my personal opinion, that's just the absolute ideal end situation. Statistically, living in your own place is the majority of living in the former Eastern Bloc, the more east you go, since clearly people hold on to their own property with all their strength, and younger people try the hardest to become homeowners, to not stay in the uncertain, barely minimum living quality hellhole called the rental market any longer than they need to, although this path is harder and harder each year for them. So in reality, the housing horror is not experienced by that many people, many adapted, but it's very generational and there is a huge quality gap. Walking around Prague, it's really super simple to spot buildings that are milked for rent and buildings that are inhabited by people who care. In other words, people who own it. It's just that there is only one common market for housing, where this arrangement fights with the speculators, so-called investors, funds, tourism, and much bigger players than an ordinary citizen. Some people might say, hey, that's the market, that's how it should be. But then some other people, me included, feel like that's not quite working. And some counterweight should be present. Laws protecting housing, functioning co-ops, and functioning city-owned housing. But such ideas are branded as pure communism, which ends all discussions. Although things are slowly improving, even over here, but perhaps too slowly, perhaps just cosmetically. So this was just a very brief introduction to how the housing policies changed. The consequences can be seen today, so I think it's worth exploring it a lot more, as of course it connects to things like urbanism, architecture, politics, economy, quality of life in general, and just city development. So going forward in the series, I will try to explore all of this in more detail, which might perhaps explain why some things are the way they are, and if they could be different. It's a series, after all, so there is no way to tell everything all at once. Now let's take a look at today's building project. So this one I'm building down here is heavily inspired by the Landsberger Tor residential estate in Berlin. It is located right on the side of Berlin's Marzahn concrete panel housing estate, so in the former East Berlin. Interestingly, it was planned all the way from 1991, with the last houses done before the end of the decade. It's an example of a rather orderly project where in the beginning there was the city's decision that there will be a new residential district, big one, followed by an urban study, followed by the actual construction by a group of investors, not just one. It was planned with proper amenities, traffic connections, greenery, playgrounds and such. Once again, in the typical German fashion of the 90s, the project looks, by more Eastern realities, much younger than it actually is, not showing much the wilder architecture, although the 90s influences are there with some details. Still, massive contrast to the nearby panel blocks of flats, which are actually not that terribly older. Looking at the projects from Prague, for example, I cannot really help it to not be a little jealous of its apparent quality. It's certainly a little outlier in the 90s and 2000s project. The place is a little upper-class housing, it seems, from reading about some really huge flats in there. Do notice the layout, the urban plan, which is a really good example of the postmodern urbanism emerging in the former Eastern Bloc in the late 80s and fully taking over in the 90s. But that's going to be topic of some other video. In the city, I chose this location exactly because of that contrast to the panel housing. Right now, it's a little rough on the edges, but as the location grows, we will add some connections to the rest of the world around it, some more buildings. I used mostly one pack of buildings to really drive home the feeling of a single development, but towards the main road, there are some different, mostly office or commercial buildings to kind of shield from the noise. And just like in real life, there is a school right in the middle, next to a park or plaza maybe, which has that typical contemporary, almost corporate artificial look. As you saw in the time-lapse, I heavily used intersection marking tools to create the brick parking spaces and add trees. That was probably the most time-consuming part of this project, also because the game crashed a couple of times because of that. Alright, so that is it for the housing policies and today's building project. But before we end, let me just quickly answer some of the frequently asked questions that I see down below the videos. Now, let's start with vehicles. Yes, I know I'm using old trams. The T3 is still fine. Sure, I could probably use some upgraded versions, but I would just have to change the asset. I don't really want to. The German 50s tram is actually still alright too, because some German and Polish cities were running those in the 90s. There simply aren't period accurate, good looking trams for the 90s in the workshop. Now, let me repeat that last part, because that's usually not understood. Good looking trams. I have downloaded and tested a lot of trams. Some are simply not good fit for the visuals of the city. quality-wise, okay? Let's put it diplomatically. On the other side of the spectrum, I also stay away from bloated assets with way too many details, as I do value the few remaining frames per second the city still has after all the years. Now, don't worry, because there are plenty of vehicles for the 2000s. I already found plenty of them, so we are just going to add so many more then. Buses, trains and cars, I'm already using new a lot. The panel factory, that is actually right next door from today's build. A lot of panel factories did survive in the 90s and still survive to this day. The need for prefabrication was still strong, although not for panel houses, but for all sorts of other elements, ranging from concrete pipes to huge bridge beams. For now, that is the lore behind Altengrad's panel factory, so it stays. Airport. I'm not building an airport, not an international huge hub, not a small grass runway club either. It's not fitting the plan for episodes, it's not fitting the city anymore, and I absolutely do not want to build an airport ever again in city skylines. It's a way too complicated project, which cannot be done just randomly. You really have to pay attention to make it realistic, and it doesn't, at the end of the day, really function all that great in city skylines, because you have to spend way too much time bending the game's mechanics, and the result is just an airport somewhere on the side of the city. So no thanks. How far into the future is the series continuing? As long as I feel like building the city, really. As long as I can think of topics to talk about, and as long as the save survives. And realistically, as long as I can justify spending time making these videos, of course, as long as someone still cares. I don't want to end it with 2024, but rather explore potential what-if future. Alright, so that's probably all I can think of right now, so thank you for watching. If you like this video, please do all the things below it, clicking, rating, sharing, subscribing. Huge thanks to channel members who are directly contributing to this channel, to me, and supporting in what I'm doing. Thank you guys so much. Take care. Goodbye.